Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the organizers, all of the presenters from today, this panel, and yesterday. Everybody's work was just amazing to see, and I'm very happy to be a part of this conference. I do not have a PowerPoint, but I do have a handout, which has been added in the chat, and transcript available on a Google Doc for those who would like to follow along that way. Sappho 94 has drawn much scholarly attention for its striking conceptualization of poetry as a vehicle for memory that can be reactivated in reading and reperformance. However, for all of the scholarly emphasis on what poetic memory can recover, many underemphasize the poem's accompanying preoccupation with loss. I argue that Fragment 94's vision of memory is twofold. The poem guides its audience in the construction of a memory world that can make connections across time and space, but this process is punctuated by insistent reminders that memory necessitates separation and that its poetic encounters are just that, poetically mediated. I offer a reading of Sappho 94 that lays out what I'm calling Sapphic memory work, a paradoxical practice of memory equally marked by the desire to reanimate the ephemeral as by the recognition of rupture and separation. I then turn to José Esteban Muñoz's concepts of utopian memory, world making, and queer ephemerality to illuminate the queer potentials of Sapphic memory work. To help illustrate how contemporary receptions might seize on these potentials, I'll conclude with a poem of Eloise Klein Healy, who has written a collection of poems about, for, and in conversation with Sappho. In doing so, excuse me, I want to foreground an idea of reading and reception as memory work that has animated my inquiry. I'm particularly interested in what it might look like to approach Sappho, that figure so loaded with queer historiographical baggage, with an eye to the queer potentials of memory, its varied temporalities, its presences and absences. And it seems to me that Sappho's own poetry provides a model in this respect. From its outset, excuse me, Fragment 94 is fraught with tension between immediacy and rupture. The fragment as we have it begins with a dialogue between the poet narrator and her companion or lover who is departing against her will. The frank opening death wish and its use of colloquial language like adalos creates an impression of conversational intimacy that is sustained throughout the direct speech of the opening section. This effect is heightened by the departing woman's apostrophic address to Sappho at line 5. Greene has emphasized the vividness of the apostrophe, one of the few places in Sappho's extant work where her name is used. Apostrophe, Greene notes, spotlights the ability of poetic utterance to conjure the presence of something or someone who is not there. This is our first encounter with Sapphic memory work in action, especially the potential of poetic memory to reanimate past presence. That said, the speaker's exchange also highlights their separation. Past tense verbs throughout the first 6 lines, and the poem is replicated on the handout, set the scene firmly in the past and remind us that memory is necessitated by rupture. That said, many of these are imperfect verbs, karalimpanin and amebaman, for example, and they suggest a continuous action and an ongoing anteriority. The scene has a liminal temporality, both of the time-bounded past and the unfolding present. At lines 7 through 8, the Sapphic narrator explicitly introduces the work of memory, saying, "Go rejoicing and remember me." This instruction raises the possibility of continuity in its insistent use of present forms, or in the case of memnice, which is a crucial verb here, a perfect form with present force. Indeed, the entire middle section of the fragment makes use of less temporally bounded verbs. Oista at line 8 is another perfect form with present force. Thelo at line 9 is a present, and pedepomen and apaskomen at 8 and 11 are imperfects with that same polyvalence as I mentioned for those in the first section. The only verb that denotes a singular, fully completed action is the aorist infinitive omnisai at line 10, to remind. This should give us pause due to the contrast with preceding present and imperfect verbs, as well, especially with the use of memnice only 2 lines before in the same position. Even as Sappho presents memory as an ongoing project for the departing woman, one that arises from the knowledge of habitual past actions, she specifies that this act of recollection, this poetic encounter, happens only once and then is gone. There's a key distinction here between an ongoing iterative process, the perfect for present memnis, and the ephemeral specificity of each iteration, the aorist omnici. Sappho's memory work must account for both. This almost paradoxical multivalence will remain as the poem moves from dialogue to description of a sensuous, all-encompassing world of memory. This is a space of physical intimacy and sensual delicacy, where the parting women once put garlands and perfumes on each other's bodies, satisfied their longings on soft beds, and haunted each and every locale. The sense of connection and co-presence in this narrated memory space was telegraphed by the first-person plural forms at lines 8 and 11, we cared and we were experiencing. And these are echoed by Epescomen at line 26, we used to be absent, and phrases of spatial proximity like humoi at line 13 and paramoi by my side at line 14. That said, second person forms dominate this section as the poet narrator turns apostrophe back on her interlocutor. Middle forms like parethekau at 14 and exalepsau at 20 vividly direct their focus toward the addressee's body. The verbs in this narration remain almost entirely in past tenses, but snapshot aorists at line 14, 17, and 20 yield to habitual imperfects at line 27 that suggest an almost ritual repetition. At the center of this final movement in line 23 is the single present subjunctive, exeis, you would satisfy your longing, infusing the intimate moment of erotic satisfaction with a sense of presence born from habitual action. Vignettes flow by, each stanza begins with a kai, joining these moments together like the plaited garlands that fill them. This cascade of flowers, perfumes, and glimpses of the body elaborate the world of memory as a space of sensory and erotic immediacy. The very final lines of the poem expand its spatial reach by negation until every possible space is haunted by the presence of the poet narrator and her beloved. Boundaries of time, space, and body grow fluid and permeable until, as Stehle has put it, the environment dissolves into a totality of sensation. And yet this immediacy is contingent. Past tense verb after past tense verb reminds us that this world is no longer accessible in the same way to the departing woman who cannot physically participate. Even Sappho's instruments of sensuality are ephemeral. Flowers are consummately fragile, like the trampled hyacinth of Fragment 105b. The delicacy of the scene is reinforced by the repetition of hapala at line 16, the woman's tender neck, and apalan at line 22 of the tender bed. Other gestures toward the body of the addressee, although evocative, are somewhat estranged and nonspecific, ritualized, or perhaps generic. The speaker herself does not even get a body in this fantasy. She is reduced to a proxemic marker, paramoi, at line 15, an index of closeness rather than an actual body nearby. If this section refers to any group ritual activity, its participants are also fleeting presences. This is not to say that the ephemerality of this poetic world detracts from its sensuous immediacy. It doesn't. The two elements coexist paradoxically. This is typical of Sappho's play with presence and absence, for example, in Fragment 2, which crafts another lush and sensuous space for ritual and erotics that is nonetheless devoid of people. In both fragments, there are conspicuous holes in the poetic fabric, tears in the papyrus of the scene, if you'll allow me a metaphor. The sensual immediacy of Sappho 94 throws its spatial and temporal fragmentation into sharp relief, and vice versa. The poetic scene is explicitly framed as a memory offered to a departing lover who can no longer corporeally experience its fleeting pleasures. And to some extent, the memory work of the poem aims to capture and preserve the addressee's ephemeral experience, to encapsulate it in a world of memory to which she can look for solace. In that sense, the world of Sapphic memory has the potential to remain eternally unfolding, awaiting reactivation in the future, but briefly and only through the contingencies of the poetic medium. Thus, the terms of Sapphic memory work, as I have laid it out, are twofold. The addressee of Fragment 94, and implicitly its larger audience, is invited to recall a poetically constituted world of shared immersive presence, but is insistently reminded that this world is demarcated by the very loss and rupture that necessitates memory at all. We can also look to the two aspectual varieties of memory at play in the poem. Memory is an ongoing process that extends into the present, memnais, versus memory as momentary, aoristic action that, once completed, is finite and fleeting, omnisci. But for another useful framework, I turn to Muñoz. Like Sappho, Muñoz attends closely to memory and its liminal temporalities. In Cruising Utopia, he writes of queer utopian memory as a performance, a technique with political dimensions and world-making potentialities. These are closely linked to the temporal aspects of utopian memory, as you can see at handout 2A. He writes, I see world-making here as functioning and coming into play through the performance of queer utopian memory. That is, a utopia that understands its time as reaching beyond some nostalgic past that perhaps never was, or some future whose arrival is continuously belated, a utopia in the present. For Muñoz, queer utopian memory is part of a process which harnesses images of the past, often artistically mediated, to critique the present and prompt us to imagine possible futures, which are not hypothetical, but actually emergent in the present. Sappho 94 dramatizes just this process. Note the reworking of language from the opening death wish in lines 8 through 10. The intensifying and contrastive particles, Hai deme Allah at the start of line 8, mark this as a point of emphatic contrast, followed by a forceful usage of ego. Ego thelo omnisci, I want to remind you, answers and corrects tethna kain thelo, I wish I were dead, replacing the wish to die with an injunction to remember. The poet narrator also reframes her departing lover's despairing hos dena piponthamen from line 4, oh, what terrible things we've suffered, with a more reassuring kala pasquamen at line 11. We were experiencing beautiful things, or we used to experience beautiful things. Scholars have read this as a prime example of the performative power of poetry in the fragment. And as Eva Stehle writes, we cannot simply speak of Sappho's recapturing memory, she reshapes it into a different kind of past. Indeed, this moment of refashioning leads directly into the narration that further develops the poem's memory space, dramatizing the world-making potentialities that Muñoz attributes to utopian memory. Sappho's injunction to remember deploys a poetically mediated image of the past to redirect despair over loss in the present toward the construction of a poetic memory world that reanimates past presence in and into the future. However, as I've argued, the world of past presence is riddled with absence, most conspicuously the separation of its interlocutors that forms the crux of Fragment 94. The women would not need recourse to the poetic world-making powers of memory if they had remained in each other's presence. To illuminate the queer potentials of this aspect of Sapphic memory work, I turn to Muñoz's work on queer ephemerality. Muñoz introduces the concept in Ephemera as Evidence, Introductory Notes to Queer Acts, which I've quoted at handout 2B, where he treats ephemera as alternate modes of textuality and narrativity, like memory and performance. Queer ephemerality is all of those things that remain after a performance, but certainly not the thing itself. The pairing of performance and memory is particularly relevant for Sappho, whose poetic attempts to preserve the ephemeral rely on just the same combination. Muñoz sustains that pairing in Cruising Utopia, where he offers the collective memory of a beloved but defunct drag show as a prime example of queer ephemerality. The regularity of the show made it feel almost ritual, but the once repeated gestures of performers and participants now only exist as a transformed materiality, an ephemeral happening. This is another familiar dynamic from Sappho 94, where the habitual ritual practices from which a participant is severed can only be accessed through memories. Muñoz also crucially notes that queer performances have a particular affinity for the ephemeral. Queer expression may be subject to violent policing if it remains legible for too long and is often excluded from or rejects institutional permanence. Queer ephemerality is queer because, at handout 2C, it is filled with the intention to be lost. Of course, Muñoz's conclusions here are grounded in a particular set of social realities and queer color critique, but it's possible to see how Sappho 94 speaks to a comparably queer sociality, if only in a sidelong way. Although the reason for the separation of the poem's interlocutors is never specified, its immutable necessity, even in the face of the woman's stated unwillingness to leave, has led many to think of impending marriage. Many have noted the important role played by this kind of displacement of women, particularly via exogamous marriage, in Sappho's poetry of departure and absence. Considering this possibility alongside Muñoz helps us better conceptualize the queer potentials of Sapphic memory work, which both attempts to poetically reconstitute ties between parted women and recognizes the ephemerality of their relationships in a world where friends and lovers could be torn apart by patriarchal fiat. Sappho's injunction to accept that loss, to go rejoicing and remember, is queer ephemerality at work. Thus, Sapphic memory work joins queer world making with queer ephemerality, encouraging its audience to embrace absence and loss, while nevertheless striving for fleeting and poetically mediated encounters across time and space. Reperformance, reading, and reception are all opportunities to step into the world crafted by Sappho's poetry and enter something like her presence. These poetically mediated encounters are temporally charged, particularly in the 21st century, and perhaps especially for queer readers who often feel a keen sense that our own histories are intimately entangled with Sappho as a literary, cultural, and ideological figure. Many of us may feel for Sappho what Carolyn Dinshaw felt for Roland Barthes, that queer historical desire for what she calls partial affective connection, for community, for even a touch across time. So I want to conclude by considering one such partial connection to Sappho's contemporary poetic reception, in Sappho's contemporary poetic reception. And that poem is reproduced at the bottom of your handout. Not Disappearing is the final piece in Eloise Klein Healy's collection, The Islands Project, Poems for Sappho, which, as the title suggests, is comprised of poems for, about, and in conversation with Sappho. I won't read the poem in its entirety because of the time, but I encourage you to read it through. It's a really beautiful poem, and I'm going to close with a consideration of it. The poem opens with a frank acknowledgement of the ephemerality inherent in Healy's project of writing poems to Sappho, which seemed to her bird bone light and fleeting. Something disappears when I talk to you, she writes, and it also happens that each word's history leads to a question. Healy admits her inability to find a means of communicating with Sappho that isn't loaded down with historical baggage, marked by temporal rupture. She ultimately declares, in a nod to the preamble of Sappho 16, that the most beautiful words are drifting, smoky things. Ephemeral and slippery then, but also enduring, with such long histories that you, that is Sappho, would have known them as I know them. After this central paradox, this retrospective turn that leaves Healy at a loss in the present, the poem looks ahead and enters its own world-making phase. As it lists possible shared points of reference in the landscape and the women who move through it, the end of the poem comes to resemble the final movement of Fragment 94. It is as if Healy is trying to meet with Sappho on her own terms in the memory bubble that constitutes the temporally liminal world of her poetry. Still, the locale for this connection is somewhat stark and bare, a beach set against a cloudless, pale blue sky. Although there are women in this space, they are about to leave it empty. Neither Healy nor Sappho are pictured there. The absences are as conspicuous as those in Fragment 94. This cultivation of shared space with Sappho is a project of queer ephemerality in as much as it is taken with a full knowledge of its own loss. Despite the enduring nature of dawn, the moon, waves and boats, laurel trees, they are still just words, drifting smoky things. That which seems the most permanent is liable to escape one's hands. Here too, we see Sappho's aspectual distinction between the present ongoing and the present ongoing and aorist time-bound sides of memory. Celestial cycles of day and night are always repeating. Laurel trees and boats did have such long histories that Sappho would have known them, but Sappho would not have known the same laurel trees as Healy, certainly not the same boats. Each morning's dawn is quite literally ephemeral, lasting only for that day. Healy's poem does not attempt to solve this disparity or avoid the problems it poses. Not Disappearing closes the collection on this paradoxical note, and in that sense, Healy follows Sappho's own modeling of memory work. She dares to build poetic connections across time and space, seeking out the immediacy of Sappho's presence, not in spite of, but with full queer acceptance of the loss necessarily involved in such a project of reception and remembrance. Thank you.